There is a particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work or lack of sleep. It comes from hopping, from praying, from waiting. You lower your head, you whisper the same words you've whispered before, and when you rise, the world looks exactly the same. The problem is still there. The pressure hasn't moved. The silence feels heavier than before. You don't always talk about this part. You don't announce it to anyone. But late at night, when the house is quiet and your phone screen is the only light in the room, the thought appears on its own. Why does nothing change? You've asked politely. You've asked desperately. You've promised patience. And still, life seems unmoved. This is where confusion begins to grow. Not loud doubt. Something quieter, more dangerous. A slow wondering about whether your prayers are reaching anywhere at all. You may even catch yourself thinking, maybe other people are heard differently. Maybe some doors open for others but not for me. And yet notice something important. Even in this frustration, you are still turning back, still asking, still hopping. That alone tells us something deep about the human heart. We do not knock on doors we believe are empty. Many people imagine divine help arriving like thunder, a sudden reversal, a dramatic rescue, a moment where everything collapses and rebuilds itself in one scene. But real life rarely works that way. Most of the time, what you call nothing happening is actually something far more subtle unfolding beneath the surface. Ibn Arabi once reminded seekers that absence does not mean neglect, delay does not mean refusal, and silence does not mean distance. Sometimes the silence is not outside of you. Sometimes it's inside, covered by noise, fear, and urgency. Think about how you approach your problems. When something feels heavy, money worries, family tension, loneliness, uncertainty, you naturally respond with force. More thinking, more planning, more worry. You replay conversations. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You push your mind harder and harder as if intensity alone will move reality. But has it worked? If force solved everything, the most anxious people would be the most peaceful by now. If pressure opened doors, exhaustion would be a sign of progress. Yet often, the harder you push, the more rigid life becomes, like trying to straighten a knot by pulling it tighter. This is the moment where Sufi wisdom gently interrupts the struggle, not by blaming you, not by telling you that you're praying wrong, but by asking a quieter question. What if the problem is not the prayer, but the state of the one praying? What if the door you are facing is not meant to be broken open, but felt, listened to, understood? In everyday life, subtle things pass unnoticed all the time. A scent moves through a closed room. A mood shifts without a word being spoken. A decision forms quietly long before it becomes visible. The most powerful changes often happen without noise, without witnesses. And yet, when it comes to our own lives, we expect transformation to announce itself. This mismatch between how life actually moves and how we expect it to move is where frustration is born. You want certainty. You want relief you can point to. But guidance often arrives as preparation before it arrives as resolution. Before a heart softens, something inside must loosen. Before a path opens, the attachment to the wrong path often has to fade. Before help arrives, the inner resistance to receiving it must be gently removed. This is why Ibn Arabi and the Sufi teachers spoke so often about subtlety. Not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality, a way of understanding that not all answers arrive in visible form. Some answers rearrange you first. So before asking, why hasn't anything changed? It may be worth asking something else. Has something in you begun to change, quietly, almost invisibly? Because sometimes the first sign is not the door opening. Sometimes it's the moment your hand stops shaking while you're standing in front of it. Ibn Arabi had a way of unsettling the certainty we place in appearances. He did not deny the reality of struggle, pain, or delay, but he questioned the conclusions we rush to when we judge life only by what is visible. In his view, nothing unfolds randomly, and nothing is ever truly disconnected from divine wisdom, even when it feels unresolved. One of the foundations of his thought is simple, yet demanding. Reality has layers. What you see is not all that is happening. What you experience on the surface is shaped by movements you cannot observe directly. The unseen does not oppose the seen, it precedes it. This perspective changes how you interpret delay. When relief does not arrive immediately, the ordinary reaction is to assume absence. No answer, no response. But Ibn Arabi invites you to consider something else entirely. What if the response is already underway, just not in a form your senses can detect yet? Here, the divine name Al-1E6DI becomes essential. It is often translated as the gentle or the subtle, but these translations only touch the surface. In Sufi understanding, L1E6DI refers to that which is so fine, so delicate, that it passes through barriers without resistance. It does not collide, it penetrates. Consider water moving through stone, not by force, not by argument, but by patience and consistency. Or think of fragrance passing through a room, walls remain standing, yet the scent is everywhere. Subtle does not mean weak. Subtle means effective in ways force cannot be. Now think about the problems that weigh on you, a debt that feels immovable, a relationship frozen in silence, a fear that has lived in your chest for years. These situations become dense, heavy, solid, and instinctively you try to match that density with more effort, more tension, more internal noise. Ibn Arabi would call this a misunderstanding of how transformation works. You cannot dissolve density by becoming denser yourself. You cannot break hardness by hardening your heart. This is why so many prayers feel exhausting instead of relieving. The heart is shouting into a space that responds to quiet alignment, not pressure. Al-1E6DI works differently. It enters where resistance blocks force. It rearranges without confrontation. It softens circumstances by first softening the one who is living inside them. This is not mystical fantasy. It is deeply observable. Think about moments in your own life when change finally came. How often did it arrive through a dramatic event? And how often did it arrive through a shift in understanding, timing, or connection that you could not have planned? A conversation that happened at the right moment. A delay that saved you from a worse outcome. An opportunity that appeared only after you stopped chasing it aggressively. These are the fingerprints of subtle wisdom. Ibn Arabi taught that divine action is not always loud because creation itself is already obedient. There is no need for spectacle. The unseen moves the seen the way roots move a tree, silently, patiently, inevitably. This reframes your waiting. It suggests that when nothing appears to be happening, something very precise may be happening beneath the surface. Not to test you cruelly, but to prepare conditions that force cannot achieve. And this brings us to a difficult but liberating realization. Perhaps the question is not, why hasn't Allah answered me yet? Perhaps the real question is, what kind of answer am I prepared to receive? If relief arrived in its full weight before your heart was ready, would it actually help you, or would it collapse you under its pressure? Ibn Arabi reminds us that mercy arrives in the form we can carry, not always in the form we demand. This is why subtle practices matter. They do not command reality. They train perception. They refine the inner state so that when change arrives, it does not overwhelm or destroy. So when Sufi teachers speak about invoking Ya El a letter 1E6DI they are not offering a shortcut. They are pointing toward a relationship with divine subtlety, a way of becoming receptive instead of forceful, aligned instead of anxious. And once you begin to understand this, a new question quietly emerges. If divine help moves through subtle channels, then how do you make your own heart subtle enough to receive it? When people first hear about reciting Ya El a letter 1E6DI 129 times, the mind reacts quickly. Why a number? Why not more? Why not less? To some, it sounds unnecessary. To others, it sounds mystical in a way that feels uncomfortable. And this is where clarity matters, because the Sufi tradition was never interested in superstition, nor in turning remembrance into a mechanical trick. Ibn Arabi approached numbers the way a skilled craftsman approaches tools, not as forces that compel reality, but as instruments that shape attention, intention, and consistency. In other words, numbers were never the power. They were the discipline. In classical Islamic thought, especially within the contemplative sciences, letters were not only symbols of language but carriers of meaning. The abjad system, which assigns numerical values to Arabic letters, was used by some scholars as a lens, a way of reflecting on harmony, proportion, and completion. It was not a promise that repeating a number would guarantee outcomes. It was a way of focusing the heart. The name L, a letter 1E6D I macron F, is composed of 4 letters. When their values are traditionally added, they arrive at 129. But the deeper wisdom is not the arithmetic itself. The wisdom is what that arithmetic demands from the one who recites it. Counting to 129 requires presence. It requires you to stay, to resist rushing, to remain with a single intention long enough for the inner noise to settle. Many people struggle to sit with anything, especially their own hearts, for even a few minutes. The number is not a spell, it is a container. Think of it this way. When you turn a radio dial, the music does not appear because you forced it into existence. It appears because you reduced the static. You aligned the receiver. The station was always broadcasting. Your effort was simply to become quiet enough to hear it. Reciting Ya L, a letter 1E6D I macron F, repeatedly does something similar. At first, the words are on your tongue, but your mind is elsewhere, thinking about bills, conversations, unfinished tasks. As the repetition continues, something subtle begins to happen. The scattered thoughts lose their grip. The heart slows, the breath deepens, the inner resistance softens. This is why Sufi teachers emphasized consistency over intensity. One calm, attentive cycle of remembrance is worth more than hundreds of rushed repetitions fueled by anxiety. The purpose of 129 is not speed, it is coherence. And there is another layer here that Ibn Arabi was careful to emphasize. Precision in spiritual practice does not mean rigidity, it means respect. Just as prayer has a structure, not because Allah needs structure, but because you do, remembrance benefits from form because form protects sincerity. Without form, intention leaks. Without discipline, desire becomes impatience. The number holds the practice in place long enough for sincerity to rise above desperation. But there is a warning embedded in this as well. If you approach this practice as a transaction, I will recite this many times so I can get what I want, you miss its purpose entirely. That mindset turns remembrance into bargaining, and bargaining keeps the heart tense. A tense heart cannot receive subtlety. Ibn Arabi would say that divine gifts arrive according to readiness, not demand. And readiness is not proven by how badly you want relief, but by how gently you can hold uncertainty. This is why the recitation of Ya L, a letter 1E6D I macron F, is not about controlling outcomes. It is about aligning with a quality of divine action that already exists. You are not pulling something toward you. You are making space. In real life, this looks very simple. The person who practices this consistently often notices that they become less reactive, less harsh with themselves, less frantic in their thinking. And from that inner stillness, decisions become clearer. Opportunities are recognized instead of missed. Conversations soften instead of escalating. To an outsider, it looks like things worked out. To the one living it, it feels like life finally stopped pushing back. So when you hear the number 129, do not hear it as a magic threshold. Hear it as an invitation to remain present just a little longer than your anxiety wants to allow. Because the heart that can stay is the heart that can receive. And now the next question naturally follows. If the number is a container and subtlety is the key, how does this actually unfold in real life, where problems are not theories but lived burdens? There is a common misunderstanding about how relief looks when it finally comes. Many people imagine it as a dramatic interruption, something unmistakable, something so loud it leaves no room for doubt. But the stories that circulate quietly among people who have lived long enough tell a different truth. The most meaningful changes often arrive without announcing themselves. Consider a man who carried the weight of debt for years, not the kind that disappears with a single paycheck, but the kind that shapes how you breathe, how you sleep, how you speak to the people you love. Every calculation ended the same way. Every plan collapsed before it could begin. He prayed, not casually, but with the exhaustion of someone who had reached the edge of what effort could produce. At first, nothing changed. Then, without framing it as a solution, he began reciting Ya'el a letter 1E6D I Macron F each night, not in a rush, not with expectation, simply as a way of calming the noise in his chest before sleep. He did not announce it. He did not test it. He sat in the same corner, counted quietly, and ended by sitting in silence for a few moments longer than felt comfortable. What changed first was not his bank account. It was his inner posture. He stopped lashing himself with panic. He became less sharp in his conversations. He began to think more clearly during the day, no longer hijacked by dread at every notification. This subtle shift made him easier to speak to, easier to trust. Weeks later, a conversation occurred that would have been impossible before. An old acquaintance reached out, not with money, but with an idea. A small opening, not a rescue, just a chance. Under normal circumstances, he might have dismissed it as unrealistic, but something in him had softened enough to listen. That opening led to another, and another. Slowly, quietly, the situation reorganized itself. There was no moment where he could point and say, "This is where the miracle happened." It felt more like waking up one morning and realizing the weight was no longer pressing on his chest the way it used to. This is how letter 1E6D I Macron F works. Another story just as ordinary. A woman caught in years of silence with a family member. No shouting, no closure, just distance that hardened over time. She carried the pain silently, telling herself she had accepted it. But acceptance and numbness are not the same thing. When she began reciting Ya'el a letter 1E6D I Macron F, she did not pray for reconciliation. She prayed for peace. The subtle change showed itself first in her tone, then in her patience, then in the way she spoke about the past without sharpening her words. Months later, the silence broke, not through apology, not through confession, but through a simple message that did not reopen wounds. It did not fix everything, but it shifted the direction, and sometimes direction is everything. These stories matter because they ground the idea of the impossible in reality, not as something supernatural, but as something previously unreachable becoming accessible through subtle shifts. Ibn Arabi taught that before events change, relationships change. Before circumstances soften, hearts soften, and before hearts soften, perception must be refined. The mistake many people make is that they stop paying attention once they don't see fireworks. They assume nothing is happening and abandon the practice just before the quiet rearrangement reaches the surface. But subtlety does not compete with noise. It waits for it to fade. Look back at your own life. How many turning points arrived disguised as ordinary moments? A conversation you almost ignored, a delay that redirected you, a loss that removed you from a path that would have broken you later. These are not accidents. They are movements that operate beneath spectacle. When people say the impossible happened, what they often mean is this: the situation changed in a way force could never have achieved. The door did not shatter, it loosened. And that is the most important distinction to understand before moving forward. Because once you expect miracles to arrive quietly, you begin to notice them. And when you notice them, you stop demanding proof and start recognizing guidance. Which brings us to the next layer of this practice. If subtlety reshapes life from the inside out, then how you approach the recitation itself matters far more than the words alone. One of the quiet dangers of any spiritual practice is the moment it turns into a deal. I will do this so that I can get that. The heart tightens without noticing. The practice becomes heavy, and subtlety, which moves only through softness, finds no place to enter. The Sufi teachers were careful about this. They spoke about remembrance not as a technique to force outcomes, but as a way of returning the heart to a state where outcomes can unfold naturally. This distinction changes everything. When you sit to recite, Ya El a letter 1E6D I macron F, the most important preparation is not the number, the time, or even the posture. It is your inner intention, not what you want to receive, but how you are willing to receive it. The practice begins with stillness. A small corner, a moment where the world is not demanding your attention. Many people prefer the quiet before dawn, when the noise of life has not yet started. Others choose the softness after Maghrib, when the day has already loosened its grip. These moments are not more powerful by force, they are simply quieter, and quiet allows presence. As you begin, do not rush. Let each Ya El a letter 1E6D I macron F fall gently into the chest. Say it as if you are placing something fragile on a surface that could crack if you move too quickly. Between repetitions, allow a brief pause, just enough to feel the words settle. This packing is not ritualistic perfection, it is attentiveness. At first the mind will wander. This is normal. Lists will appear. Memories will intrude. Do not fight them. Fighting creates density. Simply return to the name, again and again. This returning is part of the practice. It helps to release the habit of imagining specific outcomes. Do not picture the money arriving, the person changing, the problem collapsing. Those images pull you back into control. Instead, sit with a simpler sensation, the feeling of relief, of space, of something loosening. Subtlety works with states, not demands. When the count reaches its end, resist the urge to immediately stand up or distract yourself. Sit for a few breaths longer. Let the stillness remain undisturbed. This brief silence is not empty, it is integration. Ibn Arabi emphasized adab, spiritual etiquette, not as a moral lecture but as alignment. If you invoke subtlety, your life must begin to reflect subtlety. Harsh speech, constant complaint, reactive anger, these thicken the heart. They do not cancel remembrance, but they limit how deeply it can work. This is where the practice quietly extends beyond the moment of recitation. You become more aware of how you move through the day, how you speak when you are frustrated, how quickly you judge, how tightly you grip outcomes. Each moment becomes an opportunity to remain aligned with what you invoked. This is not perfection, it is sensitivity. Over time, people notice something unexpected. They stop obsessively checking for results, not because they have given up, but because a calm trust begins to replace urgency. The practice no longer feels like waiting, it feels like being carried. And this is crucial, because the moment you stop testing whether it worked, you create the conditions where it can. Allela letter 1E6DI macron F does not respond to pressure, it responds to openness. This is why those who benefit most from this remembrance often say the same thing. The answer arrived when I stopped watching the clock. But this raises a difficult truth that must be faced honestly. If subtle remembrance begins to soften you, what happens when it starts to remove the very things you have been clinging to? That question takes us to the next layer, one many people are not prepared for, but all are eventually invited to confront. There is a part of this path that is rarely spoken about openly, because it challenges the way most people imagine relief. When you call upon Allela letter 1E6DI macron F, the first response is not always addition. Very often, it is subtraction. This is not punishment, it is preparation. Ibn Arabi taught that divine subtlety does not clash with what is heavy, it dissolves it. And the heaviest things you carry are not always external. They are patterns, attachments, ways of thinking that once protected you but now restrict you. Many people expect remembrance to immediately improve their circumstances, but what happens instead is quieter and sometimes unsettling. You begin to notice your own restlessness more clearly, your need to control, your habit of replaying conversations long after they've ended, your tendency to tie your worth to outcomes you cannot fully command. This awareness can feel uncomfortable. It may even feel like things are getting worse because what was previously hidden is now visible. But visibility is not harm. It is the first stage of healing. Consider how a room feels before it is cleaned. Dust rises. Old corners are disturbed. For a moment, the air seems worse than before. But without this disturbance, nothing can be cleared. Letter 1E6DI macron F works in the same way, quietly loosening what has hardened over time. In practical life, this often appears as unexpected shifts. You may feel less inclined to chase certain validations, less willing to engage in arguments that once consumed you. Certain desires lose their urgency. Certain fears lose their authority, not because you force them away, but because they no longer feel necessary. Sometimes something external does fall away, a relationship that survives only on tension, a habit that keeps you distracted but empty, a plan that once felt essential but now feels misaligned. When this happens, it can be tempting to see it as loss. Ibn Arabi would ask you to pause there. If something leaves after subtle remembrance, ask yourself whether it was ever meant to stay. Letter 1E6DI macron F does not remove what nourishes you. It removes what burdens you while pretending to sustain you. This is where many people stop the practice. They wanted relief without refinement, comfort without change. But subtlety cannot coexist with constant inner resistance. The heart must make space. This does not mean becoming passive or careless. It means becoming less dense, less reactive, less entangled in unnecessary struggle. You still act, you still work, you still make choices, but the desperation behind them begins to fade. And something else replaces it. A steadiness. This steadiness is not emotional numbness. It is a quiet confidence that life does not need to be wrestled into submission. That guidance does not require panic. That help does not always arrive as rescue, but often as redirection. You may notice that when challenges arise, they do not hijack your entire inner world anymore. You respond instead of react. You pause instead of spiral. This alone changes outcomes more than most people realize. Because a softened heart sees doors that a frightened heart misses. Ibn Arabi emphasized that the unseen shapes the seen. When your inner world becomes less congested, the outer world responds accordingly, not by magic but by alignment. People respond differently to you. Opportunities meet you differently. Even obstacles seem to lose their sharpness. This is why letter 1E6DI macron F is described as subtle, not dramatic. Its work is surgical, not explosive, precise, not chaotic. And there is one final sign that this refinement is taking place. You stop asking, when will it happen? And begin asking, what is this moment asking of me? That shift marks a deep change. Because once the heart releases its grip on timing, it becomes capable of recognizing the answer when it arrives. And that recognition, quiet, steady, unmistakable, is what we need to understand next. How to see the impossible when it no longer arrives with noise, but with clarity. By the time this practice begins to reshape you, something important has already changed. You are no longer scanning the horizon for a dramatic rescue. You are paying attention, and attention in the Sufi path is never accidental. Ibn Arabi taught that guidance does not always arrive as an event. Often it arrives as clarity, a quiet knowing, A sense that something which once felt impossible now feels navigable, not easy, but no longer suffocating. This is where many people misunderstand what the impossible actually means. The impossible is not always a wall collapsing. Sometimes it is a door appearing where you were convinced there was only stone. Sometimes it is the sudden ability to make a decision you had been avoiding for years. Sometimes it is the strength to walk away from what was slowly breaking you, without bitterness or regret. These moments rarely feel cinematic when they happen. In fact, they often feel ordinary. So ordinary that you might dismiss them if you are not careful. You may notice that the same problem no longer provokes the same fear. The situation hasn't disappeared, but your inner response has shifted. You may find yourself speaking with unexpected calm in a conversation that once filled you with dread. Or you may realize that an option you never considered before now feels obvious, even inevitable. This is not coincidence. This is subtle alignment. When letter 1e6di F begins to work, it does not override your life. It reorganizes it. People often describe this as things just started falling into place, but what they are really describing is the end of inner resistance. Life stops pushing back because you have stopped pushing against it blindly. Think about how many opportunities are missed not because they never appeared, but because the heart was too crowded to recognize them. Anxiety narrows vision. Urgency distorts judgment. When those dissolve, even slightly, the field of possibility widens. This is why Sufi teachers place such importance on state, not mood, but inner posture. A heart that is soft sees paths that a heart clenched in fear cannot see. You might experience this as a series of small openings, a chance conversation that redirects your thinking, a delay that reveals itself as protection, a sudden loss of interest in something you were chasing that would have led nowhere, a quiet attraction toward a new direction that feels more honest. None of these shout, "This is the answer." But together, they form a pattern. And patterns are how guidance reveals itself. Ibn Arabi warned that if you expect truth to announce itself loudly, you will miss it. Reality speaks in layers. Those who are subtle enough to listen hear more. This is why the practice of reciting, letter 1e6di F, is less about achieving something and more about becoming someone who can recognize help when it arrives, even if it does not match the original request. Because sometimes what you asked for was not wrong, it was simply incomplete. The relief you wanted may arrive as redirection. The answer you hoped for may arrive as understanding. The door you begged to open may quietly lose its importance because a better path appears beside it. And when this happens, there is a distinct feeling that accompanies it, not excitement, not shock. Relief. A gentle exhale of the heart, a sense that you are no longer fighting life, but moving with it, that the burden you carried alone was never meant to be carried that way. This is the moment people later describe as everything changed, even though no single dramatic event occurred. The impossible happened, not because reality bent, but because resistance dissolved. So when you look back on your own journey, ask yourself something carefully. Have there been moments when what you once called a problem slowly transformed into guidance, so quietly that you only recognized it much later? If so, you already understand how letter 1e6di F works. And if not, perhaps this practice is not inviting you to demand miracles, but to notice the ones already moving toward you, patiently, subtly, and exactly on time. Before you move on with your day, pause for a moment and reflect. Have you ever looked back at a difficult season in your life and realized that what you once saw as delay was actually protection or preparation? That what felt like nothing happening was quietly shaping the path you needed? If this reflection resonated with you, take a second to like this video, subscribe to Voice of Sufism, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss future stories exploring the hidden meanings within everyday life. I'd also love to hear from you. Have you noticed a small sign or quiet shift in your own journey that later revealed deeper wisdom? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflection may help someone else who is still waiting. And if this theme speaks to you, stay with us. More related videos will appear on screen now, continuing this journey into patience, subtle guidance, and the wisdom of Ibn Arabi. Sometimes the greatest signs are not the ones that shock us, but the ones that gently teach us how to listen.